Привет, I'm Chuck Olenek, a Ukrainian-American, baptized with the name Yaroslav, which is the name I use in the Society for Creative Anachronism, where I'm known as Yaroslav the Persistent, or Yari. I've been putting together videos and putting them up on my YouTube channel in order to get people interested in Eastern European topics or Slavic topics. And I'm very big on primary sources. After all, I was just poking around in my library and, okay, we got one for, the kings of Britain. We have one for the Franks. So, of course, that means we needed to get into Slavic stuff. And within this is a work called the Primary Source. It's the name shortened from the common Russian Primary Chronicle. So it's called the Primary Chronicle or the Tale of Bygone Years. And it's a fairly complicated document. Actually, it's better not to call it a document. It's more like a number of them that got spliced together over the years, and hopefully that makes sense. And the Tale of Bygone Years comes from the opening sentence of the earliest known version. These are the narratives of bygone years regarding the origin of the land of Rus, the first princes of Kiev, and from what source the land of Rus had its beginning. The work is considered a fundamental source for the earliest history of the East Slavs. So it's a chronicle of Kievan Rus from about 850 to 1110. It was believed to have been originally compiled in or near Kiev. It's traditional to say that Nestor the chronicler, a learned monk in the Perchersklavra or monastery of the caves in Kiev, wrote this in 1113, a year before his death. Late 17th century writers began to assert that Nestor the chronicler wrote many of their surviving Rus chronicles, including the Primary Chronicle, the Kievan Chronicle, and the Galician Volhynian Chronicle, even though many of the events they described took place in the 12th and 13th century, long after Nestor's death in 1114. But it's also the case that the monk Sylvester of Kiev, of the Vidubetsky monastery, and he was a close personal friend of Prince Volodymyr Monomach, compiled several sources in the year 1116, so that was like 3 years after Volodymyr came to power. And Sylvester added much to Nestor's version. Some might say Nestor's work was really extensively edited by Sylvester, who tacked his own name on at the end of the chronicle. Hey, it also could have been that the real author might have been some unnamed monk from the Kiev Monastery of the Caves mentioned in the title, and what Sylvester did is he completed the work, or maybe he was a very early editor or a copyist. There have been those who argued that one of the central aims of the Chronicles narrative was to give an explanation or a justification of how the Rurikids came to power in the lands of the Slavs, and why that dynasty was the only legitimate one, and why all the princes should end their internal fights with each other and rule in peace and brotherly love. As Volodymyr Monomach, who ruled Kiev from 1113 until 1125, and who had fought a lot of wars against his kin and others, was the patron of the village of Vidubichi, now a neighborhood of Kiev where Sylvester's monastery happened to be. The new edition glorified Volodymyr and made him the central figure in the later part of the narrative. This second version of Nestor's work is preserved in the Laurentian Codex, which is the earliest copy that's available, and that's like circa 1377. Hey, that's good politics. Don't bite the hand that's feeding you. Okay, There was a third edition that followed, and it centered on Volodymyr's son and heir, Mstislav the Great. The author of that revision could have been Greek because he apparently corrected and updated a lot of the information on stuff that was Byzantine. By the way, we may as well deal with what language this was written in. The Primary Chronicle is written in Old East Slavic, but there's a lot of strong Old Church Slavonic, like early South Slavic elements in it. Although these two languages were pretty similar up to the early 12th century, scholars have noted there's a general pattern of religious passages and moral teachings that are kind of using the Old Church Slavonic elements, whereas entries on events in specific years, that's more East or Old East Slavic. Okay, this is as good a time as any to bring up the 6 main manuscripts that preserve the Primary Chronicle, which scholars study. The Laurentian Codex was compiled in Nizhny Novgorod Suzdal, that's like Lower Novgorod, by the monk Laurentius, and he did that for the Prince Dmitry Konstantinovich in 1377. All right, so we're talking later stuff. The original text he used was a codex compiled in 1305 for the Grand Prince of Vladimir the place, not Vladimir the person, and he was Mikhail of Tver. All right, and that codex has since been lost. So the account continues until 1305, and there's elements that are missing for reasons unknown. The Hypatian Codex dates to the 15th century, and it incorporates a lot of information from the lost 12th century Kievan Chronicle and the 13th century Galician Volhynian Chronicle. The language of this work is the East Slavic version of the Church Slavonic, with a lot of additional irregular East Slavisms, like other East Slavic codexes of the time. Whereas the Laurentian, or more Muscovite text, traces the Kievan legacy through the Muscovite princes, the Hypatian text traces the Kievan legacy through the rulers of the Halich Principality. The Hypatian Codex was rediscovered in Kiev in the 1620s, and a copy got made for Prince Konstantin Ostrozhky. All right, Codex number 3. The Radziwill Chronicle, also known as the Königsberg Chronicle, is a collection of illuminated manuscripts from the 15th century. It's believed to be a copy of a 13th century original. And the work tells the history of Kievan Rus and its neighbors from the 5th to the early 13th centuries in pretty much pictorial form, representing events described in the manuscript with more than 600 color illustrations, and those illustrations may have been derived from the 13th century original. Then there's the last 3. The Academic Chronicle is from around like 1500, and the Lebnikov Codex, that's like 1575, and they're basically copies of copies. And the Trinity Chronicle, which is earlier, like 1450, but some scholars exclude it. They say who count only 5 main witnesses, and there's differences and there's disagreements between the different chronicles. The chronicle offered, or the chronology offered by the Primary Chronicle, sometimes it's at odds with other documents like the Novgorod First Chronicle, and at odds with Byzantine literature of the time. And sometimes a Primary Chronicle contradicts itself, especially between narrative parts and chronological parts, and looks like it was written by different people. All right, so what kind of topics get covered in the Primary Chronicle? What's the chronology? Well, we start off with the supposed biblical origins of the Slavs from a son of Noah mentioned. And then there's the early history of the Slavs, like when they were living along the Danube. All right, you also have the legendary founding of Kiev by Ki, Shek, Koriv, and Libid. The call of the Varangians in 862. As a result, the three Varangian brothers, Rurik, Sinius, and Druvor, and their kinsfolk crossed the sea and settled themselves in various localities. And it is claimed that it was after these Varangians in the land of Rus would eventually be named, the land of the Rus. All right, around the same time, two other Varangians called Askold and Dir captured the town of Kiev. In 866, and actually using the years that are in the Primary Chronicle, 6374, the siege of Constantinople by Rus forces. According to Byzantine sources, this actually happened in 860, not 866. Then the time of Oleg the Wise, or Oleg the Wise, is going to get covered from 881 to 912, and he was involved in the murder of Askold and Dir, which put him in power, and he ends up attacking Constantinople in 907. Then you have, in 912, the death of Oleg from a snake bite. This is the one where he hears that this horse is going to be the cause of his death, has the horse staked out in the middle of a field, comes to check out the skeleton of the horse, scornfully kicks the skull, the snake bites him, and he dies. At least, and that was allegedly foreseen by him. All right, then you got Prince Ihor succeeding Oleg in 912, and he gets himself murdered in 945, and then all sorts of cool stuff happens after that, because Olga, or Olha, comes to power in Kiev, and you have Olha's legendary epic vengeance against the Drevlians who murdered her husband, so she could act as regent for her son Sviatoslav. And about that vengeance, because the Drevlians couldn't be dead enough. Okay, so you get into Sviatoslav's reign, and then after the death of Sviatoslav, you start getting into Game of Thrones territory, because there's the disputes of who is going to rule, whether it's going to be Yaropolk or Oleg or Volodymyr, and eventually Volodymyr becomes the winner. This next part goes on for a while. You have the legendary conversion of Volodymyr the Great, somewhere between 986 and 988, which is the usual date that is given for, hey, that's when it happened. And this is a huge chunk of the Primary Chronicle. 37 out of a total of 286 pages. I think that works out to almost 13% of the entire text, which this section later becomes referred to or be known as the Baptism of Rus, because it was followed by a widespread Christianization of Kievan Rus. And personally, I love the whole story about the religious choices being offered, which when I mentioned the more historical stuff to my priest, he wasn't really happy with me and said I really shouldn't talk about those kinds of things. Because there's the preferred version of Volodymyr being given choices of having his people convert to Islam and, or maybe Judaism or Christianity, and given the reasons of, hey, these guys don't drink and these guys don't eat pork, so this is like not cool, and so yay Christianity. Then there's the part of, hey, Volodymyr was a pagan, and he wanted to marry the sister of the emperor in Constantinople, and she was not going to marry a pagan. And now that Volodymyr's been baptized, you have the herding everybody into the Dnipro River in one mass baptism. You're all Christians. And then the idols being taken from the hill in Kiev, and they're being beaten with rods, and they're being dragged through the mud, very undignified, and they're being dumped in the river. And anytime they started to float back, because they're wooden idols, they're floating back towards shore. Take sticks and shove them further out in the river and have them keep going. We'll solve that problem. Now we're all going to be Christians together. Okay, so after that whole conversion of the Rus, or the baptism of the Rus, you've got more Game of Thrones stuff, more Kievan succession stuff starting in 1015 until Sviatopolk the Accursed. How bad do you have to be to get that name? Was overthrown by his brother Yaroslav the Wise, whose reign brought an end to the disaster that had been taking place with everybody fighting each other, and it lays the foundation for the development of the traditional written history of Kievan Rus. Then you go back to more of the Game of Thrones stuff, and which cousin gets to be Grand Prince of Kiev, which will eventually turn out to be a guy named Sviatopolk, which is where the original Primary Chronicle ends. That's 1110, remember? Then Nestor writes this, supposedly, in 1113. But in 1113, you have the rise to power of Volodymyr Monomach, whose religious testament and prayers were appended at the end of the chronicle by the monk Sylvester, working from St. Michael's Monastery in 1116. Unlike a lot of other medieval chronicles that were written by European monks, the Tale of the Bygone Years is unique as it's the only written testimony of the earliest history of East Slavic people. Are there incongruities? Oh yeah. And the ruling princes of Kiev had their own propagandists who rewrote these chronicles to make political claims, cast themselves in the best light, and in spite of all that, it's still a unique source. It's also valuable as a prime example of Old East Slavonic literature. Now, some of this stuff that I talked about, actually a lot of what I talked about in here, ought to be familiar, because in other videos, when I was chronicling the different rulers, I kept referring to the Tale of Bygone Years. So what I'm going to do to give you fuller accounts of the various rulers, I'll make a playlist to connect the other videos about the rulers of Kiev. All right. Until the next time, do побачення.